You ever hear a story so petty, so unbelievably stubborn, that halfway through you just sit there thinking, there is absolutely no way this ends normally? Because that was exactly my reaction when I first heard about Marcus Hale and the neighborhood HOA president who somehow thought fencing off a private access road was a smart power move. What started as a smug little land dispute turned into a slow-motion disaster involving permits, legal maps, deadlines, angry investors, and one of the most devastating cases of malicious compliance I've ever seen. And trust me, this wasn't one of those internet stories where somebody gets mildly inconvenienced and calls it karma. No. This spiraled into something so expensive and humiliating that entire construction crews were left standing around with nowhere to go. Bro, the moment Marcus stopped arguing and started quietly checking property records, everything changed. Marcus Hale was not the kind of guy people expected to go to war over a dirt road. That was the strange part. He wasn't loud, dramatic, or constantly threatening lawsuits like half the nightmare neighbor stories you hear online. If anything, Marcus had a reputation for being painfully patient, the kind of guy who spent years restoring old equipment by hand and somehow still answered rude emails with suspicious levels of politeness. He owned a modest stretch of property just outside a growing development zone, land that had belonged to his family for decades, and buried inside all that land was something nobody cared much about until money entered the picture, a narrow private access road cutting through one edge of his property. Now, on paper, that road looked boring. Seriously, if somebody handed you the documents, your eyes would probably glaze over before page 3. But in reality, that little stretch of gravel quietly controlled access to something much bigger. A nearby development project had begun expanding fast, and contractors were using adjoining land to prepare a multi-phase housing project that promised expensive homes, clean landscaping, community branding, all the polished suburban marketing language people throw around when investors are involved. The problem was simple, but also unbelievably stupid once you think about it. The most practical access route for service vehicles and construction equipment crossed near Marcus's easement line. And here's where things started feeling way too real, because if you've ever dealt with entitled people wrapped in fake authority, you already know what happened next. The local HOA president, a guy named Richard Boone, somehow developed the confidence of a man who believed neighborhood bylaws outranked reality itself. Richard loved control. Loved appearances. Loved reminding people about community standards, as though he personally invented property law. According to neighbors, he treated minor issues like state emergencies. Wrong mailbox color. Complaint. Grass slightly overgrown. Complaint. Trash can visible too long. Endless emails. That alone would have been annoying enough, but once construction plans entered the picture, Richard apparently decided Marcus's road was suddenly everyone's business. At first, it started small. Passive-aggressive notices. Suggestions disguised as demands. Claims that heavy vehicle traffic near HOA boundaries threatened community aesthetics. Bro, that phrase alone would have annoyed me instantly. Community aesthetics. Meanwhile, contractors are trying to build actual roads and houses. But Marcus ignored most of it because, honestly, why escalate nonsense if you don't have to? Then Richard escalated anyway. Without warning, fencing started appearing near the access route. Temporary barriers first. Signage. Confusing markings. Then came emails suggesting access restrictions had been approved for neighborhood safety concerns. And here's the thing that genuinely blew my mind, Richard acted so confident that half the people around him assumed he had actual authority to do this. Marcus initially tried the reasonable route. Documents. Clarification requests. Quiet conversations. He checked survey lines, easement language, county filings, and property boundaries because something felt off. Very off. And the deeper he looked, the stranger Richard's confidence became. Because buried inside decades-old paperwork sat one tiny legal detail that turned this entire situation upside down. Richard thought he was blocking Marcus. Marcus slowly realized Richard might have accidentally trapped something far more valuable. And once Marcus understood that, he stopped arguing entirely, which, honestly, should have terrified everyone paying attention. The weirdest part about situations like this is that people always assume the loudest person is winning. Richard Boone certainly acted like he was. Around the neighborhood, he carried himself with this almost theatrical certainty, casually mentioning violations and safety enforcement to anyone who would listen, as if placing fencing near Marcus Hale's access point had somehow made him sheriff of the entire zip code. Construction workers started arriving confused, delivery schedules became messy, and neighboring property owners whispered theories that Marcus had finally been forced to cooperate with HOA demands. And honestly, if you only looked at the surface, it kind of seemed that way. Marcus went unusually quiet. That silence turned out to be the first warning sign. For instead of arguing in meetings or sending emotional emails, Marcus disappeared into paperwork. County maps. Historic plats. Survey filings. Easement language older than some of the houses surrounding the project. Bro, this part genuinely felt unreal because while Richard kept flexing fake authority, Marcus quietly started tracing ownership history like someone piecing together a crime documentary. Every day after work he reviewed records, highlighted clauses, compared parcel lines, and requested archived filings nobody had bothered reading in years. The more he dug, the worse the situation looked, not for Marcus, but for everyone betting money on the project next door. Because here was the ugly truth buried inside decades of legal paperwork. The access road Richard had interfered with wasn't just Marcus's convenience route. It was functionally tied to legal ingress for portions of the adjacent development infrastructure. Not flashy language, not dramatic movie stuff, just brutally boring legal reality with devastating consequences. Several construction access assumptions appeared dependent on uninterrupted entry tied to land Marcus controlled or had enforceable rights over. And suddenly everything clicked. Richard hadn't merely inconvenienced a stubborn landowner. He had interfered with the practical route supporting timelines attached to contractors, financing expectations, inspections, and expensive scheduling windows. Hearing that honestly blew my mind because this is exactly how entitlement explodes in real life. Somebody obsessed with power over tiny things accidentally walks into giant consequences they don't even understand. Still, Marcus didn't rush into revenge. That's the part people underestimate. He gave opportunities. Quietly. 5 emails requesting clarification. Formal notices asking who authorized the barriers. Questions regarding surveyed boundaries. Requests for documentation proving HOA jurisdiction over private access easements. Calm language. Respectful wording. No emotional threats. No screaming. No dramatic confrontation. And Richard doubled down. The fencing became more permanent looking. Extra signage appeared. Contractors reported confusion entering portions of the site. Rumors spread that Marcus was exaggerating ownership claims. Richard reportedly told people the issue would sort itself out once everyone understood community authority. Community authority. Over recorded land access. Bro, unbelievable. Then came the moment where everything shifted from annoying neighborhood drama into full-scale disaster territory. Marcus stopped requesting answers. Instead, he hired a survey crew, contacted attorneys, filed notices tied to access interference, and quietly informed the county that disputed ingress connected to active development assumptions required immediate clarification. And when county officials started asking questions, investors and contractors suddenly realized something horrifying. The road nobody respected had become the single most expensive problem on the entire project. Once county officials entered the picture, the energy changed instantly. You know how some people walk around acting untouchable right up until paperwork starts moving? Yeah. That. For weeks, Richard Boone had treated the whole thing like neighborhood theater, puffing up his authority while assuming Marcus Hale would eventually fold under inconvenience. But Marcus had stopped playing defense entirely. Quietly, methodically, almost painfully calmly, he shifted into malicious compliance mode, and honestly, this was the moment the story crossed into unbelievable territory. 6. Because Marcus never screamed. Never threatened. Never tried to physically challenge the fencing. Instead, he simply enforced reality. Survey confirmations landed first. Legal notices followed. Access disputes tied to development ingress triggered review processes nobody on the project had expected to deal with mid-construction. County inspectors requested clarifications. Permit assumptions suddenly looked shakier. Contractors started pausing activity because nobody wanted liability attached to disputed entry points. Equipment schedules slipped. Deliveries stalled. Crews stood around burning money while managers scrambled for answers. And here's the twist that genuinely made my jaw drop. Marcus realized he didn't need revenge. The paperwork itself was revenge. Since Richard had effectively interfered with access tied to land Marcus controlled, Marcus stopped allowing informal accommodation entirely. Before all this drama, he'd been cooperative, reasonable, flexible, practical. Trucks used familiar paths. Temporary workarounds existed because Marcus wasn't trying to create problems. That ended. Everything became formal. Everything became documented. Everything became conditional. If access required agreements, Marcus wanted updated legal protections. Insurance confirmation. Boundary recognition. Recorded acknowledgements. Timelines. Written accountability. Suddenly every shortcut developers had quietly benefited from disappeared under layers of exact compliance. Bro, hearing this blew my mind because this is peak karma energy. Nobody forced Richard to create a fight. Nobody forced him to fence off access and pretend authority existed where it didn't. But the second he escalated, Marcus simply followed rules harder than anyone else. And rules are expensive. 7 project delays turned into panic. Investors reportedly began demanding updates. Supervisors faced impossible scheduling headaches. Deadlines slipped into financial consequences. Every day equipment sat idle cost money. Every delayed inspection rippled outward. What started as one entitled HOA power move transformed into a chain reaction bleeding time and cash. Then came the moment people around town never stopped talking about. Richard allegedly tried walking things back. Suddenly the same guy obsessed with enforcement wanted reasonable conversations. Suddenly barriers weren't a big deal. Suddenly compromise sounded attractive. Too late. Marcus had already moved past arguments. The road was now governed exactly as recorded. No favors. No assumptions. No shortcuts. And the project Richard thought he was controlling? It sat effectively landlocked behind consequences he accidentally created himself. By the time things finally settled, the entire situation had become a cautionary tale whispered around the county like local folklore. The fencing quietly disappeared. HOA emails stopped sounding aggressive overnight. Richard Boone, once unbelievably confident, suddenly kept a much lower profile, which honestly says everything without needing dramatic speeches. Because when reality catches up to entitlement, people tend to go very quiet. Marcus Hale never celebrated publicly either, and weirdly, that made the whole thing hit harder. No victory lap. No smug neighborhood performance. He simply enforced agreements, finalized legal protections, and made sure every inch of access tied to his property stayed documented moving forward. Construction eventually resumed, but only after revised permissions, clarified boundaries, and expensive delays nobody could ignore. 8. And here's the part that genuinely stuck with me, Marcus never destroyed the project. He didn't sabotage anything. He just stopped allowing people to benefit from assumptions after somebody tried weaponizing fake authority against him. That distinction matters. Because this wasn't chaos, it was consequences. And honestly, that's exactly why the ending feels so satisfying. Sometimes karma looks less like revenge and more like somebody calmly handing accountability back to the person who created the mess. Bro, Stories like this always leave me thinking about how fast fake authority collapses the second reality shows up with paperwork. Richard wanted control, Marcus wanted peace, and somehow consequences did all the talking. But honestly, what would you have done here? Drop your thoughts below, and stick around because this one still feels unreal.